if you need for the pause. Alexis, benefits and challenge for income stabilization tool.
Okay. Yep. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. What I'm going to try to do is, because listening to Christian and Julian, I think you'll have an illustration, very practical one, of what has been said. So there will be some repetitions, but through an example, a very practical one, which is the income stabilization tool. I'm not sure whether some of you are familiar with that. Probably if anyone is not familiar, just to give you an idea, it's a concept of a mutual fund that is based on a gross margin index. So we talked about it with Julian just now, and this is the idea of this IST. In French, we call it ISR, ISR, but this is the same. So it means income stabilization tool. This is a system that first was developed and introduced in the CAP. So there are people who are not from Europe. CAP is the Common Agricultural Policy, and what it means is that in this broad regulation, there was the possibility, it was introduced in 2014, and it's still a possibility to develop those type of mutual funds. So since 2014, there have been a few adaptations, and one of the main or most important for us in the sugar beet sector, we talked about the sugar beet sector, so I'm happy to show that we are tackling and trying to do our best to make it work, especially with systems like insurance, not only reducing the amount of pesticides, but using any kind of tools we have in the box. And so this is a project that was run by the sugar beet sector, and that relates to this tool. In terms of context, it brings back a few elements that have been mentioned previously, but I love this graph because it explains everything in a very visual way. What you see here is the evolution of, first in green line, is the income for sugar beets over the time, and then in the red line, what you see is the production costs. And the result here in the blue chart is how the margin, the sugar beet margin, has evolved. By margin, I mean what is left to remunerate family labor and to invest in the farm, so that we are clear, because there are a lot of different way to refer to margin, so it's easier to make it clear from the beginning. And what it shows you is that, as you can see, there is an increasing variability in terms of revenues and in terms of margins. Why is that? If it works, yeah. Because we have had a number of issues. So I've just listed those issues. And there are three distinct types of issues, and it relates to the three categories of risk we have in agriculture. Here, this is the droughts, and it relates to climate. So this is the climatic risk. And it affected the sugar beet crop. Then you have another type, which is the economic risks, and it translates into two distinct types of risks. The price risk, but also the production cost or risk, which is and has been very, very critical since 2022 and the start of the war between Ukraine and Russia. Because as you can see, we have had a sharp rise in these production costs, and it relates to mainly inputs and energy. So this is the second type, and the third one, probably the most important right now, the sanitary risks. Why is it critical? Because in Europe, the regulation is calling for less pesticides, which obviously is a good thing as such, but the seamy side of that is that there is a rising problem with sanitary protection. And therefore, you can see that there is more and more issues with this third risk that used to be less important. So when you look at this graph, you have a recap of the three distinct type of risk we have in agriculture, and you have also an explanation of why our sector, the sugar beet sector, started to look at the problem and think, okay, how can we reduce this variability? Because in agriculture, and especially in the sugar beet sector, we have, I would say, a collective problem. For mills to be able to process and make a living, they need some raw material. If they don't have the raw material, they cannot survive. So by securing and diminishing the variability of the costs and the margin, we would be able to secure the acreage, and by securing the acreage, we have a good chance that we will have enough raw material for the mills to transform and process. So it was really a collective issue, and this explains why we dived into this IST. In terms of context, this is another element. It might be useful. I'm not going to go in too much details, but here you can see the different type of risks I've just mentioned. And this is how we deal with it in France, using different risk management tools. So for climate, we have the so-called climate insurance, or MRC, which for sugar beet applies to 35% of the total French acreage. This is a system, and that's what is really important on this slide, that is targeting yield losses. In the meantime, we have another system in France that is called, it's a mutual fund for sanitary and environmental problems. And this is something that is mandatory. So every farm pays an amount, which is 20 euros per farm. And by this premium paid, the mutual fund is able to cover for some costs incurred by disease related to regulated sanitary risks. That's an important thing in France, and it's where it becomes a little bit complex. We have so-called regulated disease, and we have non-regulated disease. So you have to imagine that you have a list of disease. If you're in the list, you're eligible to be covered by this system. But if you are not, it's a lot more difficult, not for me to say that it's impossible, but it gets very tricky to be able to receive any sort of support of this mutual fund. So what it shows you, if it works, no. Anyway, what it shows you is that the economic risk and the non-regulated sanitary risk was not covered. So, and this is getting bigger and bigger, as you could see on my previous slide. And this is where the IST comes. Why is it a very interesting or inspiring system? Because it's based on a gross margin index. I'll get back to that, but that is a very, very useful point, because for a farmer, what matters is not his yield. What matters, as was said by Julian, is the result of a yield multiplied by a price. And that's what a farmer looks at. How much do I make out of this crop? Thank you. If you ensure my yield, that's a good thing, but it's not enough, and that's only part of the equation. The other important thing is that it's a very flexible system. So it allows you to basically have an all-inclusive coverage. It was also mentioned before by Julian, when you start to try and cover different sanitary risks, for instance, the problem that you may face is that you have to determine what part of the loss is actually related to this disease or not. And it starts to become very complex when you pile up a different an additional disease to another. It's too complex. So this system is interesting because we don't look at in details into what sort of disease created the loss. We are just looking at the broad overview of the margin, and if the margin is below a certain point, then we trigger potential compensation. So it's a lot more flexible and adaptable. So let me just have a quick explanation on how it works, this index. So as I said, this index is targeting the gross margin and not yields. Like that, you're able to basically cover the whole economic equation for a farmer. And this is the equation that we used when we developed our project. So the index is a result of a sugar beet price which is based on a public reference. That is very important. Why? Because if we were to use private prices, we would have a problem. We would introduce a bias because companies are not necessarily operating the same strategies. They may diversify or not, and this results potentially in a different price. So to have something that is even, we said to ourselves we need a public reference for this price. The sugar beet yield, this is the easy part, is based on the individual or the farmer that subscribes to the IST. So we have this information, but that may not be the case for other crops. In the sugar beet sector, when you deliver your beets, you receive a paper that states how much you've produced and how much you're going to be paid for that production that you delivered to the mill. So this is an information that we have pretty easily. And the access to information, I'm not sure whether it was mentioned before, but it's a very critical point. Do you access easily the data when you implement a risk management tool? If no, if the answer is no, then I think you will have definitely a problem resulting in a timing issue, which was mentioned by Julian again. Then we have operating costs. So for that part, we looked at regional operating costs indexes. Why? Because we cannot ask a farmer to provide all this information. It becomes too troublesome. And when it's too troublesome, people are not moving in or subscribing to the tool. So we looked at this regional index and we realized that the dispersion towards the mean value is quite low, actually. Meaning that we are not wrong, and this relates to the proxy. So we had a rather fairly good proxy to determine what is the level of operating costs. Yes, it's not perfect, but it stands a very good chance to be in the right. So that's what we did. And then the CAP subsidies were also added, and for that matter, we used also regional values. The reason I'm describing this is just that it illustrates the type of thinking you need behind the construction of an index. You want to refer as much as you can to public references, because if you do that, it's transparent and it cannot be manipulated. The other element is the dispersion towards mean regional or at the department level values. When you do that, it's, or if you're able to do that, that is very interesting because it saves a lot of time to the farmer and he doesn't need to fill in tons of papers or key in a lot of things in the platform, the informatic platform. Then he will be interested to subscribe to the event, to the tool. So this is what you need to keep in mind is in the context that we are, data is critical. This is just an illustration to show you how it translates in a very pragmatic way. So we've done this exercise with farmers when we implemented the project and also at a regional level. So it shows here the fluctuation of the index. And the system works in a very simple way. If you're below, if for the year 2022, for instance, or let's say 2020, I was below 20% of my Olympic mean average, then I'm eligible for a compensation. So like that, you can see, and this is a good illustration, that you need a rather simple rule to make it appealing for a farmer. In that case, it's not that complex. The farmer can even do the calculation on his own, and he knows whether he's eligible or not. Simplicity is important. So I'm not going to go into too much details, but it was also mentioned in terms of context, what matters is what risk do you cover, because it directly impacts how much you're going to pay. In that case, we performed and we used a set of data that was long enough to allow us to have, I would say, a mathematical